It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 478, February the 1st, 1981. There are many interesting stories in the news, too many to cover in 1 hour a week on KLRB, and often the subjects seem to jump around. They appear to jump and not have a home base to center themselves, although they do, and if you listen enough, you'll catch on to the limbo and the way the names flow together week after week if you have the patience to listen to them to that format. And often there are new radio stations that take on these tape cassettes. There's one this week that is beginning to subscribe to the programs with new listeners. So I think it's important once in a while to explain what the program is about for the old listeners as well as the new listeners, and explain why I have the title World Watchers and what I'm doing. The material I cover on this program has to do with basically three things. The choice of forms of government, fascism, democracy, or communism, the way that heads of governments are selected, and with democracy in the middle, the tendencies that we're swinging to the right, to fascism, and losing the democracy that we have, which isn't very many years old actually, or the pull to the left of the people's movements and the third world to get America concerned with the activities of people and their rights and benefits. One form of fascism is called National Socialism. That was Hitler's socialism. And then, of course, communism and socialism are on the left. In addition to kinds of governments, I'm concerned with the agencies that are used to force these policies upon people or influence them. So sometimes I talk about police systems that are corrupt and cruel, or prison systems, or prisoners in false arrest or murdered in prisons, or armies, the military and the courts, the use of news media, the use of medicine, energy, mind control. Those are drugs, medications, tortures, and so forth. So the agencies that are used to influence the way our government goes are the legal, the professional, the medical, and the military, various establishments, and the agencies under them like the IRS, the National Security Agency, the FBI, and CIA. And then, of course, there are the people who are either the recipients of good governments or they're the victims. And in my way of seeing things, if these people have protection, if we have fair housing and education and employment and health care and recreation, things are going well. And as these things diminish and power gets in the hands of a few at the expense of the rights and welfare of large masses, it's a cause of concern, whether it comes from the left or right. But I try to see how governments, including the United States government, are overthrown by military coup or dictatorships where heads of states are in power because they specifically murdered their predecessors and assumed power. So I talk about these kinds of government and their agencies and the people that they control. I started this 17 years ago when I wanted to find out who killed President John Kennedy and who was covering up that murder. And the quest seemed easy enough. I don't know why I didn't think it would be that difficult to find out if I pursued the matter. And in the course of pursuing this matter, I came across names repeatedly in books and research or documents, starting with the Warren Commission hearings and studying history of rearming of Germany from the time of World War I was over until the present time on the verge of World War III. Names such as Herbert Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, Randolph Hearst, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, William Sullivan of the FBI, the Rockefellers, David Rockefeller, and then wedded with these people were Nazis such as Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Hitler's intelligence, and people such as Richard Helms and John J. McCloy and John McCone and E. Howard Hunt and Adolf Hitler, of course, and wedded also with them was a crime syndicate that blended together the Gambino family, Lucky Luciano with Mussolini, Gambino with the Vatican, and Carlos Marcello and Meyer Lansky, and the organized crime families that formed the syndicate and became wedded not only to Nazism but to fascism, and combining narcotics traffic with gun running. So that I noticed, as I began to collect books and articles and read more and more, as have many other people noticed, that heads of states were continuously being killed. Our former OSS became the CIA, and the CIA became carefully melded with organized crime after the war, and with Nazis who were released from the prisons in Germany or didn't go to prison at all, and continued their policies in South America and Shanghai and Africa in the Middle East. So as the subject became more complex than who killed Kennedy, the same people who were behind the murder of John Kennedy, who planned it and covered it up, were involved in these other activities too. And as a result of 17 years' work, I have come to the conclusion, through my research, that our federal agencies, specific agencies such as the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and so forth, have all been pressed together to put down labor unions or social programs or kill radical or liberal leaders or cultural leaders and social leaders, and going into musicians and artists and writers and entertainers also, while they develop their police and armed forces around the world. And as I say, they used the mob for killing and wiping out counter forces, and in exchange, the mob was promised that if they would use their goon squad as killer teams, that the mob would not be prosecuted for their narcotic imports. And that brings in Air American, Flying Tiger, and books on the war in Vietnam and China, and the United States government and military planes going into the narcotic business, and culminating in stories that I've had recently on KLRB of large amounts of money being stolen from banks every single week, unaccounted money that ends up in the hands of mobs and drug programs, gun running, experimentation, and fascism, so that the huge profits today are no longer $1 or $2 million that are exposed changing hands, but it'll be $55 million at the Nugan hand bank that's missing from Australia, and $22 million from another city in Florida, and $50 million from Minneapolis, and $23 million from Houston, Texas. And a truck with $27 million of heroin was shipped to Louisiana this week, and the mob didn't pick it up because it was marked. An entire ship is disappearing that was supposed to have corn that was to be transferred for heroin coming in from the Middle East. The ship, the Poet, is missing in Scotland Yard, and CIA link it to the Gambino family. So you don't get a plane load or a paper bag filled with 7 pounds of heroin. You get the entire ship. And what we're seeing in the headlines around the world in the newspapers I'm getting now are the reports of catching some of the people but letting the others slip away, and the system seems to be coming unglued after 47 years of this intense traffic and the huge amount of money handled. There are mass murders, whether it's 900 plus at Jonestown to hide gun running, narcotics, international money, banking, medical experimentations, or whether it's 3 in Santa Barbara, or whether it's 6 or 8 with the Lufthansa burglary in New York City at the Kennedy Airport, and another 4 in San Francisco. There's a handful of people everywhere from 2 to 5 to 7 up to 900 plus that are all linked to common cities, South Africa, London, Germany. Certain banks are being pilfered out of millions of dollars, and it's this kind of a web of traffic that just at this time in history is coming unglued, and it's a phenomena that I will be talking about for many, many weeks on this program, because it's happening now. $25 million was missing from the Wells Fargo Bank in Beverly Hills this week. Missing millions, this Jack Bender that I briefly talked about that I want to go into more, a man with international connections from Israel to Hollywood, to Canada, to South Africa, and linked to Joseph Mengeles. And all of these people, as I say, have common denominators of German contacts, London or South Africa, Canada, and a lot of money is being transferred or, in quotes, missing. Nobody is speaking up. The cases get lost in the news. A lot of people are dying, and it's very necessary to pick up these pieces as they unfold. And that's what I'm going to do for the next weeks to come, or as often as I see this happening. So if I talk about robberies at the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco, or Wells Fargo in Beverly Hills, or Bank of America, or Chase Manhattan, or Morgan Guaranty Trust, or the Franklin Bank in New York City, the $45 million missing that Michael Sindona, the Vatican, evidently knows where it is, but he is in jail in New York at the present time. The figures run into the many, many billions, but it's just a question now of how long this thing can keep going until it really does get put together by the proper authorities in some way. In October this year, there was $140 million that I talked about. It was on a tape 467, and the $50 million from the Nugan Hand Bank, as I say. In Australia, 12 million missing from Paris in a safe deposit box in November 1980. Another 10 million was taken for a Nazi resurgence group from Nice, that Albert Spaghieri, who said it was for Nazi resurgence. And the figure goes up to hundreds of millions, and I'm beginning now to put the date the news story breaks and the source, how much money is missing, the banks, and the cities. All of this should be put into a computer, and it's almost impossible now, the way the news is going to keep track of it alone, or even if I worked with a staff of people. I don't do that, but it almost is time to just quit typing and get rid of the filing cabinets and get stuff onto computers where you can get a printout and come up with patterns and locate right-wing resurgent Nazi activity funded with gun-running narcotics traffic that involves federal agents of the United States government. And I'll give you some examples of that in a little while. Before I get into that, I do want to just run over for 1 second a few stories in the news this week, because Ronald Reagan is so important to follow, and we don't want to lose sight of him. He's going to entertain the president of South Korea tomorrow, Chun Do-hwan, and he has gotten the Kim Dae-jung's death sentence put aside. He's to stay in prison for life. I had said on KLRB that if that man were hung in South Korea, I really did think I'd have to leave this country as soon as I could. I just wouldn't want to be around as an American. I hope that he doesn't, in quotes, commit suicide in prison, but the president of South Korea, who's taken away all rights of students and news people, who has a total dictatorship, is just about the first head of state, and wouldn't you know it, that Ronald Reagan will be meeting. Now, the reason to study these assassinations, it's so important, is to keep track of how many heads of states have power today, because they're directly linked to specific murders that preceded them. Ronald Reagan has worked closely with the team of people from the Alpha 66 and anti-Castro Cubans, and Richard Nixon's team, the people that killed John Kennedy. He has protected and worked with, and he came into office not having to compete with the power of Nelson Rockefeller, who was done in about 2 years before these elections. Nelson Rockefeller was quickly cremated on the orders of a doctor from South Africa who works at the hospital there, where they didn't examine the body to see if he was poisoned, and no questions about his Secret Service guards who were supposed to be with him. Ronald Reagan is linked to this assassination team. Mr. Pinochet is in power in Chile, working close with Reagan and his administration because of the murder of Salvador Allende in Chile. We're now entering a period in the White House where a known murderer, a horrendous murderer who was actually involved in the murder of the person he followed, is going to be entertained in the White House. And we're doing a lot of business in China with an administration that did in Lin Pao and has now sentenced Madam Mao Zedong to life in prison. Lin Pao was murdered so that these people could take power, and then George Bush, as director of the CIA, future director, was also ambassador to China and is working over the death of that leader. And a strong influence in politics today, in the Polish government, and the possibility of starting World War III is Pope John Paul II. And of course, in Italy, there were headlines that John Paul I was poisoned. The 30-day Pope was poisoned. So in the United States and in Chile and South Korea and China and in the Vatican, you have specifically people whose power was gained by the intentional murder and knowledge of the murder of the people. Then these people usurped their seats. And the problem with not solving murders such as John Kennedy's or Robert Kennedy's or Martin Luther King is that the murderers stay in power tighter. If you don't put them out because of their crimes, that gives them the permission to continue them if they want. There's an article in the Los Angeles Times this week. It's the anniversary of the death of Mahatma Gandhi, another person who was a symbol to the British to get out of India, and the article has a tragic tone to it. Gandhi, his image fades for the Indians, and it tells how the upper classes have no interest in him, that they thought he was too austere, and they were uncomfortable with his turning away material possessions, and 97% of the students in India know very little about Mahatma Gandhi or know nothing about his fast and his moral power when he was trying to prove arguments against the Hindu government in Calcutta years ago. The students don't know about him. And January the 30th, 1948, just 2 days ago, and quite a few years ago, but not enough, Gandhi was murdered, and he's now actually almost in obscurity in India. The universities don't teach courses about him, and they want to forget that he existed. Another leader who was shot this week that we haven't heard a thing about is Bernadette Devlin. A group of people, 3 people, broke into her home in Ireland, and they hit her 7 times in the chest, hip, leg, 3 gunmen, and they used sledgehammers. She was in a cottage with her husband. She had 3 children. She was getting ready for school. She said as she went to the hospital, now they think they've got me, but I'm not dead yet. She's still alive, and her husband is still alive. He also was gunned down 3 times in serious condition, and she's holding on. But there will be this continuous slaughter of people who speak up and are world leaders unless there is a positive effort to change the society. Ronald Reagan had his first press conference this week, and he began by calling the Soviet Union terrible names. At his press conference, he said the Soviet Union is willing to lie, cheat, and commit crimes. And these were terrible words for the President of the United States to get up and do. He said they would do anything they had to do, that this was their policy. I don't say that the Soviet Union doesn't lie. I don't say the Russians don't cheat. And it would be hard to say they don't commit crimes. But I've done research for 17 years, and I've been on KLRB and on the radio 9 years. And I think we should look at ourselves and not keep yelling at what the Soviet Union is doing. That's what Adolf Hitler did while he displaced or killed and disarranged about 80 million people on the continent of Europe and the Middle East and South Africa. All over Europe, and every country was affected by Hitler. And I don't think it serves any purpose to constantly listen to politicians say they do this and they do that any more than it does for families or people to point out to their neighbors if they can't keep their act together themselves. And this country has so many crimes and murders and cheats and criminals working for them that it's hard to believe that Ronald Reagan can say this and get away with it and start this country on a clear path of going forward with that kind of remark. One example of the inconsistency of that kind of thing is a trial was just completed in Oakland of a woman. She's called Darlin, but she's not very Darlin. Darlin June Cromer. And she was charged with killing a black child's death. And at first, the case was very hushed up, and it was secret. testimony there of this woman, and she wanted to barbecue black children. She wants to eat them and cut out their hearts, and she took this one little child and strangled him. He was 5-year-old in Alameda because she got delight in killing blacks, and she expressed the idea that when she got out of jail, she would go down to the South and join the Klan and continue this thing because she thinks that these little people should be roasted and cooked. And this is very important to her, that these people be eaten. The people like to eat them, the blacks, like chickens and cows. That's the way she talked. And barbecue the blacks. Well, a listener subscriber to my tapes and a fellow researcher sent me an article from the San Francisco Examiner that maybe many of you didn't get on the East Coast, and we certainly didn't get it much on the West Coast. But at the trial of Darlin June Cromer, this was January the 8th, 1981, and the Examiner, a boyfriend of hers, was called. He was supposed to testify at her trial because he was with her the morning that this 5-year-old Reginald Williams was strangled, and he was with this lady. Now, this Ron McCannis, his name is McInnes, was supposed to testify because he said he works for President Nixon and President Ford, and that he killed 4,047 people in his cloak and dagger world, among other things, as an FBI investigator. And the Examiner carried a story that he was an aide to 2 United States presidents. He was a top general's aide in the Army. He's a nuclear weapons expert called upon to disarm and arm atomic bombs. He's a special FBI investigator who was licensed to kill and maim. He's a member of Her Majesty's Secret Service, in which he was only licensed to kill. He was an aide to President Nixon, and he banked $13 million for President Nixon for investment purposes, but he couldn't collect that fortune for at least 2 years. He said right now he lives on Social Security, but he talked about his exploits as Nixon's aide and worked as a special secret task force handpicked by the President of the United States to wage war on the Italian mafia-controlled drug market. We didn't contact the governor or federal drug officials. We netted billions of dollars of narcotics. Now, you have a man talking about being responsible for murdering over 4,000 people, for working for 2 presidents of the United States. And I said many, many times on these programs that the White House is a battle between the Irish FBI mafia, the Robert Mayhew Intertel type that took over when Howard Hughes moved to Vegas to take over from the Italian mafia, to wipe out the Gambino family and the other Italian mob families that Jimmy Carter represents, the Georgia mafia, a group that profited heavily by the Shah being out, letting him out with traffic coming in from Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran. And that the Nixon-Reagan gang and Paul Axalt and the Hughes gang were working with the Irish mafia. Now, this article simply is about a trial witness for little Darlin Jane Cromer, but it gives you an idea of the murders, of the racism, and the use of this particular man for mafia wars by the presidents of the United States, and he's talking about $13 million payoffs for presidents, and it's talking about billions of dollars in narcotics. So, as I said in the introduction of this program, which you may play over again if you have the tapes and wonder why I talk about these matters, you get the White House, the mafia, killers, money, drugs, one section of the mafia wiping out the other section of the mafia. Now, this McInnes said he has taken the lives of these 4,000 people, but he didn't think anything of it, and this is from the San Francisco Examiner. He said Gerald Ford told him if he was asked that he only killed 300 people. And after doing this job for 13 years, he got, in quotes, bad trips and on LSD. And then he was at the trial flirting or looking or smiling at Darlin Jean Cromer, a woman who was very anxious to barbecue blacks and eat them alive. And this is very similar to the articles in Buffalo about cutting out black hearts. And she's testifying that she thinks that powerful people The court quoted this woman as saying that there's powerful people that shared her view of black people, that they were less than human and meant to be eaten by white people like chickens and crows. And at first she distrusted the masses because she didn't think they shared her opinion. Now, the psychiatrist who comes in to testify for her to get her not the death penalty because of killing a black and invading the civil rights of this little child and strangling him, the man who comes in as a psychiatrist to try to get her a Dan White defense of insanity is Dr. Donald Lund, the same fellow who published a book, Murder and Madness, published by Stanford alumni, who works with Stanford Research, who's written about all the California violences I've referred to for years on this program, whether it was the Oda family or Edmund Kemper, and he's the expert on this crazy California violence, testing mind control, testing assassins and mass murderers. Lund is the man they call in for the mass murders, in this case, this single woman with the black child, this known racist attack that she's done. He becomes the expert, just like I mentioned last week or a few weeks before, that Dr. Diamond, who was a psychiatrist for Sirhan and hypnotized and programmed him, is now with Mark David Chapman, the man who killed John Lennon. The police Gestapo establishment has select doctors for the courts. They have select witnesses. And it's this kind of information that is linked to Ronald Reagan's gang and his team that makes me wonder why he has the right to tell the Soviet Union about lying and killing and cheating. These crimes and this criminal that was at her trial, who was with her the day that little boy was killed and strangled, they laugh at you and me because nobody is sitting and doing anything, and they know they can get away with it, and as she says, they're supported by the right people. I have a bunch of headlines here. I'm not going to make comments about them, but I don't want to let them go till next week, so before this half hour is over, I'll just share some of them with you. There's a Harry Horn, a Canadian speaker, who came to the World Affairs Council in Monterey this week, who heads an organization called FIRA, Foreign Investment Review Agency. And he is asking Canada, he's a Canadian, to look into other countries owning Canada. And he said when the Arabs and foreign interests step up their takeover of American companies, you may want to look into the FIRA and review your investments, that foreigners control in Canada 50% of the industry. And of course, in the United States, they're buying up with the narcotic money that they're shipping to us. They're buying up the farms, the factories, the food chains. The A&P is German. You can check out the multinationals, the drug companies. They will control our agriculture, our news media, our sources of information, our food, and foreign companies are using the money from the narcotics. We pay them so much for our narcotics, and with that money, they're buying up this country. So that the problem of drug trafficking and putting all that money into the till for them for opium, hashish, cocaine, that the middle class thinks is so chic and cute to be sniffing this expensive cocaine, all those profits are being put into gold and into capital of other countries to buy up the United States of America, and piece by piece it's being sold out. A Salvadorian human rights director was kidnapped. He hasn't been found in El Salvador this week, and he was speaking up against oppression there, and he's disappeared. The Arabs have urged a holy war against Israel this week, and Mr. Yamani was on ABC TV saying that we will raise the price of oil, and then we will raise it again, and we will double it and double it. He said this January the 30th, 1981. And he said we will cause inflation in the United States, and we will cause depression and repressions, and we will do this until you are prepared to take a stand against Israel. So a lot of people can't play ignorant to that little announcement this week. The Arabs urge a holy war against Israel, and Mr. Yamani is saying that the Arabs can force a repression and depression and inflation in this country. So they're warning, and again will probably be immobile to do very much about it. I have a picture of book burning in Omaha, Nebraska, some more album covers, record covers. This time the album The Animals and the Omaha Christian School in Nebraska is burning music albums. The Atlanta, Georgia officials are asking for help. 17 black children have disappeared. 14 more have been slain. They haven't solved the murders in Buffalo, New York, where they're cutting out the hearts of black people. 4 gas station attendants have been gunned down in Rockford, Illinois. And as I said several months ago, it's open hunting season. And when are people going to be prepared to stop this kind of slaughter on our soil? And is it going to be too late by the time they catch on? The United States, for the first time this week, says that they're easing up on their reporting of aliens in this country. They used to list themselves in January, but they've run out of paper. There's a shortage of forms this year. They can't distribute them, therefore they're going to be lenient. Can you believe how many illegal aliens will be flooded into this country to move out the workforce? And the excuse was that there's not enough paper. I heard that Ronald Reagan used $60,000 worth of paper the first 2 days of his transition team, but the aliens can't be registered this year, and they can cause a lot of unemployment of our own Chicanos and blacks and white Americans. And now, under the excuse of paper shortage, they're slowing down the registering of these people. And last, Yoko Ono sent $25,000 to the New York Police Department. It was reported this week with a message: you are special people. You certainly are among the most beautiful of people. That's the New York Police Department that knew that Lennon was stalked for 3 days, that refused to accept the picture of the man with John's assassin and allowed John to be photographed for cover magazines on the slab when he was murdered. She thanked the police with a check for $25,000. You are among the most beautiful of people. That is the end of the first 30 minutes, and we'll get back to some of these stories in about 1 minute. It's Mae Brussell and Carmel.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, this is Mae. There was an article by a writer. He wrote one book, Looking Out for Number One, Dr. Wayne Dwyer. He has a new book, The Sky's the Limit. I like what he writes, and I like to hear him on KGO radio, the talk shows, and see the comments he has, because Dwyer always talks about people not using their abilities to achieve things that they should be doing in the world or to find much out of life that has meaning. And there was an article just this last week, a resume of his feelings about depression, and the article is called Don't Let the Headlines Get You Down. And there's headlines about the stock plunging and nuclear mishaps, and 24 reported slain, 300 raid on the U.S. Embassy. He's got a list of murder plots and things, and asked, are you depressed? And his answer, for people, oversimplified, but he covers it a lot in his book, is that the only reason people are depressed when they see headlines and the news media is that they feel helpless and that they're not willing to aspire. He says most people are victimized not because they fail to achieve, but because they fail to aspire. They lack the courage to take on institutions, he said, and they're afraid of big guys, that they can't face the government. They say the government is too big, and they'll complain about the Middle East or crime. And he says the minute you give up the solution, give up thinking about the solution, it only gets worse. It never gets better. And if you allow yourself to become part of the problem, you never can find the solution. And he suggested things that I've suggested many times. Write letters to your representatives, write letters to companies, picket companies or organizations that are destroying the environment, have discussion groups, take positive action with friends or other people, and don't feel like the system has licked you, because if you feel it's too big and you get pessimistic and you don't take action, you lose something. And if you take action, you have a feeling that you at least have a part in being constructive. And sometimes constructive people do set the way and others follow. There's a man that passed away this last week. His name was Louis Lundberg, and he was vice president of the Bank of America. And the article over his obituary in the newspaper said, banker kept his candor in the establishment world. And it tells how he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1970 and denounced the Vietnam War, and at the time they thought it was like treason. And he said that it was wrong. The capitalistic democracy had to have moral integrity. And they had a quotation, "No more powerful and sweeping denunciation of this nation's Vietnamese degradation is likely to ever be voiced." He was 74 when he retired from the Bank of America. He opposed the war, and we're still paying the debts to this immoral, terrible war. And I'm sure that one person alone like Lundberg doesn't make a difference, or the youth out on the street protesting. But when you get men such as a Lundberg, who's the vice president of the Bank of America, arguing with Mr. Giannini over certain loyalty oath issues way back in 1949 and taking stands to preserve what he wants in a democracy, when you get people like that standing up, it does influence a certain position of people in Congress to not turn Vietnam into a parking lot and not to use the atomic bombs there. So that there are people in the establishment speaking up, and it's so unusual for them to do it that they even made a note over his obituary saying that he had candor in an establishment world. I know it can be done, and the thing that Dwyer writes about is enough people who know what's going on aren't taking a position to stop the terrible, horrendous acts that are being perpetuated by our government. We don't have to watch other governments, as I say, but we should watch our own. There were getting now to 3 television shows this week that were interesting. I don't usually cover television programs on KLRB, but there were 3 this week that were interesting. One was called The Bunker, a 3-hour program put on by CBS. Then there was one on mind control, and the control of a fellow who was in the military, James Thornwell, who was given LSD by the Army, and it tells about his crazy desire to die and how terrible it was to be given what the Army had called EA 1729, which is LSD, how he begged to be killed and wanted to die. And many people who do get LSD are suicidal. We hear about certain rock musicians committing suicide, and I'm sure that they were administered this product manufactured by the Army. And then there was a program on the Broder Band. That's a very strong cult in South Africa that was formed right after World War I in 1919. Their strength became much bigger, and they combined with Adolf Hitler, and they're a violently anti-black organization that runs South Africa and their apartheid policies. And there was a interview with a man who keeps the blacks in their place down there, as he said, and they asked him, don't you think you go too far? And he said, no, the blacks have to learn to walk first. He says, you can't run before you walk. And while they're human beings and they breathe like me, they just haven't started walking yet, so they can't run to progress. The Bunker was the most terrible movie I've seen in favor of Nazi Germany. I felt it was very pro-Adolf Hitler. It was sponsored, if you look at the credits, by Time Life, the Henry Luce organization put it on. And then at the movie, they have books to read, one by Mr. Toland on Adolf Hitler, and the other, U. Trevor Roper's Last Days of Hitler. And I have very strong feelings about the possibility that Hitler escaped from the bunker. I think the Goebbels family did, in fact, die. But this movie was very pro-Hitler, and they gave speeches of Hitler, and you could almost see them recruiting for the next generation. It was filled with disinformation. At the end, they said Martin Bormann died, and it's a pretty well-known fact that Martin Bormann is still alive today. As I say, the mind control program was exactly as it happened, and the fellow who was given the LSD got a settlement from the government. They paid him money, the largest settlement they've ever given, $625,000, and he was interviewed on the radio and said that's exactly the way it happened. And really the motive for singling him out was that he was attracted to a white woman in the GI Club in France, and they said black men don't mix with white women. So they used the excuse that some documents were missing and tortured him and experimented on drugs that have kept him sick and unable to hold a family or a job to this day. and finally with attorneys through the Freedom of Information Act, they found out about his torture. The Broder ban brought in certain scandals of the government and the use of their secret money to barely hit it, buying off newspapers that praised the South African government, the propaganda to make them palatable and acceptable to the Western world. But these were interesting programs, all interrelated, the Adolf Hitler story and the mind control story and the South African, because very many people in the news today go from South Africa to London and Germany and to California and to the headquarters where a lot of this drug smuggling, gun running, racism, funding of fascism is taking place. There was a death last week. I got an article, again, from the same listener who got the Cromer story for me up in the San Francisco Examiner, a story about an attorney passing away just last week, Robert Story. He was an attorney who was selected by the Texas officials to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. Robert Story died this last week in Texas. The interesting thing about the obituary was it tells how he was not a lawyer in his life. He never was a lawyer, but he became head of the American Bar Association. He was one of the people that went to Nuremberg to, in quotes, try the Nazis, along with Leon Jaworski, who later was recognized as part of the Anderson CIA Foundation. And he went to the Middle East and South Africa again and Southeast Asia. And Story has been a powerful State Department official and a dean of law without ever going to law school in Texas. Edward Epstein described in the book Inquest how after John Kennedy was killed, a conference was set out with the White House. The Texas Attorney General Wagner Carr announced they would have a court of inquiry. And these two men, Leon Jaworski of the CIA and Robert G. Story, were special counsel. They were supposed to be special counsel for this investigation. And in this book, Inquest, Epstein describes two prominent Texas lawyers. Well, it turns out that one of the two was never a lawyer and never graduated from law school, so that the two people assigned to investigate John Kennedy's murder in Texas were Leon Jaworski of the CIA and Robert Story of the State Department, international man with government Pentagon links all over the world. Now, as soon as Kennedy was killed, many people yelled conspiracy. They suspected when Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered that this inquiry to begin on the 25th of November was not sufficient, so that on November 29th, Lyndon Johnson appointed a commission to investigate the murder of John Kennedy that became known as the Warren Commission. And of course, he had Leon Jaworski as an advisor from the CIA, and then he put Alan Dulles, the former director of the CIA, and Richard Russell, the watchdog of the CIA, and John J. McCloy, whose office wrote false papers for agents of the CIA, and chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. And the entire Warren Commission was stacked. Gerald Ford from Navy Intelligence and CIA, and these hand-picked people of Earl Warren's continued covering up the lie of who killed John Kennedy. But it's interesting that Robert Story died this week. There wasn't anything in any paper that I noticed about his death, except for the clipping I got from the San Francisco Examiner. Maybe you have some notices, but I don't have those around. Now, to get to a trial that's going on, because I won't be able to cover a lot of the material I brought in, but we'll do as much as we can. There's a trial going on in New York City of Jean Harris. She's the school mistress who killed Dr. Tonauer, the famous Scarsdale diet doctor. And those of you who have my tapes or those who want them, I did broadcast about Jean Harris on March 28th last year. That was just a year ago, 1980, tape 434 and 435. With the links of Mrs. Harris. She was in the Soviet Union a year before Lee Harvey Oswald went there as an agent of the CIA. She worked for Allied Maintenance, owned by Gulf and Western, from 1975 to 77. That was a janitorial service. And then took a job at McLean University, Virginia, not University, Madera School, a girls' school, where she led what they called a private life. And I did tapes on the Philadelphia connections. The time Dr. Tonauer was murdered, Angela Bruner of organized crime in Philadelphia, her home base was murdered. An Abscam was breaking, and I felt there were links of them to an international narcotics, again, a high-level narcotics CIA combine, and that Tarnower was wiped out, and this woman was a woman of mystery. And she's been going to this trial, and her defense is that he had so many different women that she had to shoot him. He was sleeping with all of these women. But one article in the New York Times gave a clue to what I was aiming at in the past and watching about the background of this Jean Harris. It's an article January 26th, this last week, and it describes Mrs. Harris as headmistress for this school in McLean, Virginia, and it goes into her prescriptions. The pharmacist, Joseph Eisenberg, was testifying last week about her. She had 10 prescriptions. She had Desoxin, which was a stimulant, and Percobarb, a sedative, and Percodan, a painkiller, and Plexanol, a depressant, and Valium, a tranquilizer, and Nebutol, sleeping pills. And she was known at the school as somebody who expelled girls who had drugs. This woman was very strict on children, any kind of drugs, and yet she had a whole walking who's who of medications, it seems. But one interesting point about her trial is that her son was testifying at the trial, James Harris, and he's in the Marines now, and he went to her home, and 2 vials of medication had been delivered to her house the day after the shooting. Evidently, she didn't realize this delivery was coming, and drugs must have been shipped to her from the pharmacy up in Westchester, White Plains, New York. So she had gone up to shoot Dr. Tarnower, and I compared her to Candy Jones, that she was under mind control and was hypnotized and was used by the CIA and had this double personality, the school mistress plus the international traveler with this mysterious, well-funded Dr. Tarnower. And right after she was arrested the next day, some more drugs came to her at the Madeira school, and her son, who's in the Marines, testified that they found empty medication vials in her medicine cabinet, but they were also prescribed for a person whose name he didn't recognize. Now, an important part of putting together the pieces that I did last March and April on Mrs. Harris and the killing of Dr. Tarnower, with the possible links to the whole Abscam, Angela Bruner, this system coming unglued of drugs, trips to Russia, trips to Europe. She would go to Paris with him, lots of money, mysterious connections. The who here is what we have to find out. Whose name were the drugs being sent to? Because just the week before this happened, Alan Lowenstein was murdered in New York City, and he was murdered by a man who was under mind control, such as Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon. This man's name was Dennis Sweeney. And March 21st, a year ago, I was asking questions about the man who murdered Alan Lowenstein, the former congressman and the right-hand man of Ted Kennedy at the time the elections were coming up, because Sweeney was married to Mary Byrne. That was the chief of Jimmy Carter's drug narcotics group in the White House. That was his first wife, and Sweeney had undergone mind control and again had been sent to Europe and mental hospitals. And so I have to ask the question for you readers and listeners who save these articles, was she administering in the Washington area in McLean, Virginia, prescriptions that were coming out of White Plains, New York, that were shipped from the pharmacy to her, and whose name was there that they didn't recognize? Certainly they weren't students in the school. And this woman lived a double life and worked for a mob group at Madison Square Garden that were linked to the highest echelons of American business, that have also been involved with narcotics and Bolivian cocaine. I did a thing several weeks on that. I don't want to jump around too much, but these stories are coming together, little pieces, and I have done many tapes and broadcasts on Jean Harris and Tarnower. So when we find out who the medications were going to while she was the headmistress at McLean, Virginia, I think we're going to find high up ranks that go way in back to London with her Philadelphia friends such as Cummings or Monaco, and the international drug, the headquarters in Paris and London, and the trip she took to Africa with Tarnower. I think they were into a lot more, and that she was like Candy Jones and was controlled and could go up there and shoot him with 4 bullets and say she wanted to die. There's another program, a lot of programs I did on Michael Sindona. a man that was the financier for the Vatican who met with Pope Paul VI when he was Montini and began investing Vatican money into organized crime. And I did many broadcasts on Sindona and how he escaped from his jail and went to Europe last year. And for those of you who want the link of the Vatican to the Gambino family and organized crime, you can write, and I'll give you the dates of those tapes. Those go back to November 1979, November and March of 1980. I was talking about Sindona. In March, I did a program on Sindona, alias J. Bonamico, Bonamico, who flew to Vienna, Munich, and Germany when he was arrested by the New York Police Department for taking this $45 million from the Franklin Bank. He went to Frankfurt again, Frankfurt, Germany, and then came back to New York, and he had invested Vatican money with links to the Carlo Gambino family. Now, this week there was an article, To Fight Vatican Deficit. Pope John Paul II has called in economic experts because the Vatican is $19 million in deficit for the first time in 2 years. Now, the Vatican money is tied in to organized crime, and it's being strangled. Just as Richard Nixon's administration was cutting off the Italian mafia, there's an interconnecting web between the Italian-Irish mafia fighting, and the Vatican money was put into organized crime, if you can believe such a thing. Well, last week you may have read in the newspapers about a jailbreak attempt in New York City. An armed man and woman hijacked a helicopter from New Jersey and went after allegedly a convicted narcotics dealer, a known murderer, and they tried to land on the 12th story of the Metropolitan Correction Center in New York City. Funny enough, they couldn't get through because the wire was too heavy and they couldn't cut through the heavy wire. But up on the roof with this known murderer and one of the largest dealers of narcotics in New Jersey is none other than Michael Sindona himself, the financier for the Vatican, who was paying Nixon and Maurice Stans and helped invest in the Watergate Hotel when it was built. The Vatican owned that. Up on the rooftop is none other than Michael Sindona, one of the inmates who the San Jose Mercury described as the Italian financier, with Robert Weiler, the 43-year-old recently convicted narcotics dealer. They thought Weiler was the target of the raid, and there was a 3-hour siege. And Sindona, the article goes on, it says, Sindona, the Italian financier, was convicted last year in a multi-million-dollar international banking fraud, was among the people on the roof, but they believe the actual target was Weiler of Manhattan, who was recently sentenced to 20 years. Weiler has been known for narcotics charges and murder, the murder of a pimp over his 14-year-old prostitute. He's a member of the mafia, and the helicopter was taken by a Miss Sanchez out of New Jersey and arranged to, with a Vietnam veteran from New Jersey to help fly these people. They had a lot of cash, paid $1,600 for the helicopter and so forth. So the article doesn't go into the background of Sindona. It says that they were going for the murderer and the narcotic dealer, but the interesting story, of course, is that he did escape once and went to Europe and came back, and here he's on the roof to escape again. And what I call a laugh a minute, I did several weeks ago, it really is a comic situation or a tragic situation that, as I say, since World War II, since Lucky Luciano, heavily embedded with the CIA, and he had helped put Mussolini into power, and this element got the bankers of the Vatican to invest and mingle, if they didn't do it before, and I don't know how much they did before, after World War II, they invested into operations, and when one group of the crime syndicate, I call them the Irish mob, want to wipe out the Italian mob, they tangled the Vatican with them, so that this John Paul II is strangled, and they own a lot of property. The Vatican isn't poor. They own a lot of church land. And they could begin selling their property, the $19 million deficit, they could just sell their church on Wilshire Boulevard, and that would pay the deficit. But the problem is that they're caught in that web that I described the first half hour of this program, that even the churches and the presidents, and what is happening now is the financiers and bankers are getting insecure, and the system is falling apart. This missing money isn't going to hold up, and I wonder how long it can go before there's an end to this kind of conspiracy that webs all these various forces together. Next week, I want to do at length, begin, because I'll just have a few minutes now, a story that came out of the San Francisco Chronicle last week, January the 11th, with a headline story, the CIA is linked to a curious case, the mystery of a disappearing actress, the CIA. Now, this case involves a woman, Valerie McDonald, who hasn't been seen since November the 9th. It involves a murder of one of the men who allegedly abducted her by the Royal Canadian Police in British Columbia. And it involves various countries and a prison guard who was buying weapons for gun running in El Salvador to put the right wing in power, who worked with 3 prison guards in San Francisco. And one of them, the prison guard, rather, was getting the weapons for 3 former prisoners that were just released out of San Quentin. One of them was killed by the Royal Canadian Police. The other gentleman is released. His name is John Abbott. His father represents the United Nations over in Rome. His mother's a professor at Davis. He's being held by the Canadian Police. A Philip Thompson, who was an apartment manager who just got out of San Quentin, and a Michael Hennessy, who was murdered by the Canadian Police. Now, a prison guard was out buying the guns and weapons, sending them to El Salvador. It involves the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco, where millions of dollars could be missing. This John Abbott, the son of the fellow who works for the United Nations in Rome, again in Rome, Italy, whose mother's a professor, started collecting stolen art goods and art objects and was caught with $250,000 of stolen property, a cache of automatic weapons. This is a story of people with cement and rope and hotels, brilliant IQs. It's a story that headlines the CIA linked to the death of an actress. And as the story unraveled since January the 11th, it involves, as I say, the right-wing fascist group in El Salvador, a prison guard who resigned from San Quentin, who worked with 3 former prisoners. 3 people have been murdered that are linked to this case so far, and the murders, I'm sure, will escalate. And international travel is a woman from Germany, from Canada, New Mexico to California. And again, it involved guns, heroin, millions of dollars, credit cards, a prison guard, former prisoners, international connections, all to fund, if they would send guns down to El Salvador for the right wing to put down the people's movement, they could return get cocaine, and $1 million worth of cocaine would bring them $11 million in this country. So what I'm talking about is right-wing counterinsurgency, definitely linked the first time by the headlines to the CIA. Now, all of these things later get linked to the CIA or the Drug Enforcement Agency, but this right from the word go said CIA linked. And that's why I think the system is getting unglued when top people with inside knowledge of the Hibernia Bank can squeeze it out of millions of dollars that is put into guns that go to South America. In return, they bring cocaine and narcotics to this country so that in exchange for those guns down there, millions are taken out of banks knowingly in the United States. Millions of dollars are put into weapons. The weapons are sent to Nazi right-wing groups all over the world: Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey. We send them guns. They send back the narcotics. The narcotics bring a profit of 10 to 1, and with that money, we buy more guns, and the banks, in the meanwhile, have to explain where these missing millions are going. And the federal agencies, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the CIA agency, the FBI are involved in these things, the police, and so forth. So the economy, I don't think, can take this kind of treatment much longer. The banks can't take it. And I'll be doing more on this next week because you just see a simple article in Wells Fargo and Beverly Hills this week. Bank probing apparent loss to embezzler. One embezzler, several $1 million. This was January the 30th, 2 days ago. And then it says, appears to be an internal job. It may be up to $20 million gone. How many banks can face that kind of millions, and how many around the country are doing it? And these fascist governments are run by a bunch of hoodlums, so that the educated, knowing people who are being pushed aside have to have some counter reaction. So this buildup from World War II of using organized crime, gun running, and narcotics seems to be coming apart at the seams. If you take a map and mark the cities, it's astronomical, the figures and the implications, and how far it'll go, I don't know, and how much they're arming private police like the Nazis or the Minutemen and the Klan. That we don't know. That murder that's involved with that Cromer girl in Oakland talks about, he is responsible for security of atomic bombs. Imagine a man who kills over 4,000 people, he says, for 2 presidents, who's in charge of transporting atomic bombs. That is the crazy world we're living with. Well, we've got a little while to think about it. I'll be back with you next week on KLRB. It's pretty startling, but we have to watch it because it is happening, and these headlines are coming out every single day. Different cities, different names, but the same kind of operation. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week, and you take care.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.